Long before I was a pastor, I had a job that involved working alongside lawyers as they navigated lawsuits and prepared for depositions and trials. My responsibilities often included drafting examination questions about the financial issues of the case, based on the reams and reams, really boxes and boxes and boxes of documents that we had reviewed and analyzed. There was a very important rule when drafting these questions. Never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. That rule was about control. It was about protecting against surprises, keeping things as safe and predictable as we could. And I confess I still use this tactic from time to time as a parent of teenagers. In our somewhat bizarre gospel reading that Emmanuel just read for us, Jesus is approached by a group of Sadducees who seem to be using a similar tactic. A question meant not to discover, but to control. A question they are certain will expose the absurdity of his beliefs and humiliate him in front of the crowd. So they lay out that scenario for him, right? There's a widow, and she marries her husband's brother, and then he dies, and then his brother, right? Until we get to all 7 have died, and the widow is still there. And the question they ask after the widow dies is, in the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will this woman be? Their question is rooted in a law found in Deuteronomy that required a man to marry his deceased brother's childless widow to provide an heir and continue the brother's family line. The Sadducees who were asking the question, they were a powerful aristocratic group. They were composed mainly of high priests and nobles and wealthy merchants who controlled the temple. In the writings of Josephus, who was one of the historians of their time, the Sadducees are described as a, quote, elite upper crust who were able to persuade none but the rich. They believed only the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were authoritative. They rejected many of the oral traditions of the Pharisees, such as the resurrection of the dead, life after death, and the existence of angels. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they represented opposing movements in early Judaism. And though we often find Jesus in conflict with the Pharisees in gospel texts, his beliefs were actually aligned in many ways with those of the Pharisees. So what's going on here, it isn't just an argument about law. It's a power play. The Sadducees are trying to trap Jesus on their turf using their rules. In their mind, there is nothing in the Torah, nothing in the teachings of Moses that supported a belief in resurrection. They want to prove that Jesus' belief in resurrection is foolish because his teachings are dangerous to them. Now, Jesus, in an unexpected twist, he uses the words of Moses to make a case for resurrection. He says to them, the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed. In that story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him, all of them are alive. Essentially, Jesus is arguing that if there were no resurrection, Moses would have spoken of God's relationship to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the past tense, since they were dead in this age. But Moses doesn't speak of them in the past tense. He refers to them in the present tense. And if he refers to them in the present tense, Moses must have understood them to be alive with God. Mic drop. Resurrection, baby! That's all, Your Honor. I rest my case. While Jesus' imaginative interpretation doesn't exactly spell out the resurrection of the dead, it's as if he's saying to the Sadducees, don't you get it? God's ways are not the ways of humanity. Stop thinking so small. Stop thinking so small. Be open to the mystery. Be open to the absurdity. Jesus refuses to let them shrink God to fit their logic. He widens the frame, cracks open the mystery, and shows that the living God cannot be contained by our small certainties. And that's where this story, that's where it starts to meet us. Do you ever find yourself thinking small? I find myself thinking small more than I would like to admit. I like answers. I like knowing things. I really, 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 really like being right. I mean, I went to seminary for answers. You can imagine my shock and horror when I realized my time there wasn't going to be about learning right formulas, but rather about learning to ask good questions. Not questions that control the narrative and shut down the conversation and box people in. Okay, there were people who in seminary who were big on those kinds of questions, but questions more rooted in humility and curiosity and wonder and awe. Questions that beget more questions. Questions that teach us to get comfortable dancing in paradox. Cuban-American theologian Kat Armas calls this paradox the heart of our Christian faith. In her new book, Liturgies for Resisting Empire, she writes, and I'm quoting her here, Christianity is a religion of paradoxes that says the first shall be last, that power is made perfect in weakness, that life comes through death. Things that should cancel each other out instead intertwine and persist like vines twisting and thriving in places where they shouldn't be able to grow, and yet they do. Christianity at its essence is an invitation into the mystery of God who is present in all things, unexpected, interwoven, and always defying the limits we are trying to place on the divine presence. Now, if that sounds abstract, it's not. That kind of paradox, life springing up where death has had the final word, it's happening all around us, even now. I saw it last Sunday sitting in a dark theater as Neil and I watched the final performance of Vicki Clark's latest show, Punch. Punch is based on the true story of Jane Scourfield, David Hodgkinson, and Jacob Dunn. Scourfield and Hodgkinson are the parents of 28-year-old James Hodgkinson, who on a summer night in 2011 was knocked out and eventually died by the single, unprovoked punch of a total stranger. Jacob Dunn was that 19-year-old stranger. hard to imagine that Scourfield, Hodgkinson, and Dunn would have a relationship that was recently described by their New York Times interviewer as warm and collaborative. Punch tells the story of how their willingness to engage in a process known as restorative justice transformed their relationship from one of victim versus offender, from one of animosity and ambivalence to what it is today. Victim and offender working together to educate people, to change laws, and to establish a right to restorative justice in the United Kingdom. For those who might not be familiar with the concept of restorative justice, it is a voluntary process designed to hold offenders accountable, to meet victims' needs, and to reintegrate both of them into community. Sometimes it could take the place of traditional sentencing. Sometimes it's part of parole. The unanswered questions about her son's death at Scourfield, which was played by Vicki Clark, could not let go of. They were the impetus for her engagement with the restorative justice process. Hodgkinson, on the other hand, he was very resistant to participating in the process. He was with his son the moment he was knocked to the ground by that single punch. He knows his son did nothing to instigate it. He knows his son is dead. And he knows that the last words he spoke to his son, "You're going to be okay," were untrue. He knows everything he needs or wants to know. The show doesn't get into why he ultimately participates, though it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine that perhaps it was an act of love for the mother of his son that moved him forward when he wanted to stay stuck in bitterness and anger. Today, Hodgkinson describes himself as feeling quite protective of Dunn. For his part, Dunn said the experience of interacting with his victim's parents was like, quote, having God himself questioning me. What the theatrical production of Punch makes clear is that the almost unbelievable, miraculous even, transformation in the relationship between Scourfield, Hodgkinson, and Dunn came not only in big moments of courage, but also in small moments of humanity. In one of the most powerful and touching moments of the production, the audience bears witness to the first in-person meeting between the three, after they had previously exchanged some letters. In laying out the ground rules for their encounter, the facilitator asks if a handshake would be agreeable. Hodgkinson cannot imagine shaking the hand that threw the punch that killed his son. Handshakes are off the table. But later, when Dunn meets the parents of his victim face to face for the first time and is so nervous that he spills water everywhere, Hodgkinson not only cleans up the mess, he refills Dunn's glass, looks him in the eye, and hands it back to him. A small act of compassion and empathy that recognizes his humanity, and it settles Dunn, and it enables him to stay in the process. A small act of love, a seed of hope planted. Like the Sadducees, despite all that Hodgkinson thought he knew and the perceived absurdity of what his son's mother was asking of him, there was more to be imagined. Another way of seeing and interpreting what was right in front of him. What Punch shows us is that resurrection often begins in small acts: a glass of water, a shared glance, a risk of compassion. That's how new life starts to take root. And it leaves me wondering, what are the things that I think I know that are pointing me to despair rather than hope, to animosity rather than love? What are the things I think I know that are obscuring my capacity to perceive the presence of God in unexpected ways and in unexpected people and places? What are the things I think I know that might be distorting my faith? Because the moment we think we know it all, we close off the possibility of surprise, the very space where grace loves to dwell. Faith should not compel us to comfort and control. It should move us to create space and plant seeds, to create space and plant seeds so the absurdities of God might take root. The miracle of Punch wasn't that everything was fixed or that pain disappeared. The miracle was that new life became possible in a space that had been marked by death. That's resurrection work, not just in some far-off next age, but right here, right now, wherever love dares to risk itself. And that, I think, is what faith at its best calls us toward. Not certainty, not control, but the courage to stay in the process. The courage to meet face to face, to listen, to risk compassion, to believe that even when pain and violence has drawn its lines, God can still write something new. And that same resurrection courage, that willingness to see and be seen, it isn't limited to the stage or to the page. That same spirit of resurrection and relationship will be alive in this sanctuary later this week as we host our Defending Dignity Eyes on the West Bank conversation. We'll hear from Jewish Israelis and Palestinians who are daring to imagine life beyond despair, who are practicing the small sacred acts of seeing one another's humanity and refusing to give up on peace. Friends, faith doesn't ask us to have all the answers. It asks us to stay open to the mystery, to live as if resurrection is possible in our relationships, in our city, and in our world. So when we come to the edge of what we think we know, may we not cling to certainty, but open ourselves up to the absurd, holy possibility that God is not done yet. And may we, by God's grace, become part of what God is still doing, still creating, still reconciling, still raising from death to life. For the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the living, is still shaking the heavens and the earth, still calling us to imagine what new splendor might yet rise from the ruins. Amen.